If you've ever wanted to eat a cloud, about the closest thing you're going to get in the kitchen is making homemade gnocchi. While ingredient-wise, gnocchi are very simple, potato and flour. If anyone tells you they're really easy to make, they're wrong, because these are actually one of the trickier things to get down, especially when you're not using the extra binding power of egg. That being said, before we actually start this process, here are two big pro tips from Mark Vitri's book, Mastering Pasta. Number one is limit moisture in all steps of the process. We will do this through baking the potatoes instead of boiling and ricing the potatoes in a thin layer while they are still hot so the steam can escape. In general, Vitri says the drier the potato, the lighter the gnocchi. Number two is limit the flour and work the dough as little as possible. We want to mix in just enough flour so it holds together with the potatoes, not any more. Additionally, we don't want any gluten development through flour hydration, so there will be no kneading, and we will work the dough as little as possible until it just holds together and is tender. If it is overworked, the gnocchi will be stiff instead of pillowy soft when it's cooked. So keeping those two things in mind while we're making these, let's dive into the process. Start by gathering around 1,000 grams of russet potatoes, or in my case, this was roughly 6 medium-sized potatoes. Put them on a wire rack over top of a baking sheet. Now we're going to prick the potatoes with a fork to help the steam escape, and we are using russet, which are Vitri's favorite, and my favorite that I've used before too, for their low moisture content. Though if you ask Marcella Hazan, she says in her book russets aren't suitable and boiling potatoes should be used. Everyone's got an opinion, I guess. Anyway, place the pan in a preheated 450 degree oven and bake until they are fork tender in the center. This will probably take 45 to 60 minutes depending on the size of your potatoes. Turn the baked potatoes out onto your cutting board and slice them all in half and let that steam escape, and then we're going to remove the flesh with a spoon. With the potato flesh acquired, we're going to rice the potatoes out onto a work surface in a thin layer. Now, if you don't have a ricer, these can be mashed with a fork or potato masher. Just try to work them as little as possible, but I'll be honest, the potato ricer is the perfect tool for the job. Now we're going to let these potatoes cool for about 3 to 5 minutes just to allow some of that extra steam to escape. Now for demonstration purposes, I'm going to divide our potatoes in half to make one batch with just salt and a second batch with some additional flavorings. For the base version, sprinkle salt over the potatoes and use a bench scraper to work the salt throughout. Give the potatoes a taste until it tastes good to you. Now for version number 2, sprinkle over the salt, and now we're going to add a bunch of fresh cracked pepper, some freshly grated nutmeg, fresh thyme leaves, and I just realized I forgot to add in the Parmesan cheese. So add that, don't forget like I did. Other than that, it's the same exact process as before. Use the bench scraper to work the seasonings in throughout the potato and taste it until it tastes good to you. So what we have here is just some well-seasoned potatoes. To turn that into gnocchi dough, all we have to do is add flour. Now if you were using eggs, this is where they would be added before the flour, but like I said earlier, we are going without. Add the flour to a fine mesh sieve and gently dust it over top of the potatoes. Now this is pretty key to gently dust it over top because it'll mix easier without having to overwork the dough. And also, a lot of gnocchi will have you use type 00 flour, which is probably more optimal. However, this isn't something that I typically have in my pantry, and I find all-purpose works just fine. With the flour dusted, this is where the rubber meets the road. Gently work the dough together with your bench scraper until it has a uniform consistency. This is where you need to be careful and not overwork the dough. Vitri says the flour is only there to just hold together the potato. If you overwork the dough, the gluten will make your gnocchi taste tough instead of tender. However, in my case, I ended up slightly under mixing the dough, and while they still roll out fine, they did come apart a little bit while boiling. So work it until it just comes together and feels tender. It's probably not going to be perfect the first time, but that's cooking for you. With the dough together, pick it up with your hands and work it into a rough log. Now dust some flour over your work surface and over the top, and we're going to cut a large disc off. Now just work this into a longer snake shape and repeat the process, cutting off a chunk of the dough and working them out into those snakes. Now it's time to shape them. Using the bench scraper, cut the snakes into maybe 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch chunks for each one. As far as shaping goes, you have a couple of options. Number one is just leave them as is for boiling. Number two, using a fork, lightly press the gnocchi into the back of the fork tines and roll it away. This is probably the shape most people think of, but my favorite is number three, just rolling them into little balls. I think they look the best, and honestly, they're way easier than number two. Whichever one you choose, repeat the process for the remaining gnocchi, and now we can talk about cooking them. Before we head to the stove, let me talk about storing these. So fresh gnocchi should be cooked the same day it is made, but Vitri says it can be stored in the fridge for up to 8 hours. Alternatively, you could make a large batch and keep them on the baking sheet to freeze before transferring them to a Ziploc bag, and that is perfect because you can boil them straight from frozen for made-to-order gnocchi. Anyway, here's how I'm going to cook it up for our fresh ones. To start, set a pot of water on to boil along with a couple large pinches of salt. Meanwhile, you're going to set a bowl of ice water to the side. You're going to add in the gnocchi to the boiling water and let them cook until they start rising to the surface. You can test them by gently squeezing between your finger. It should slightly bounce back, not flatten. Once there, you're going to toss that gnocchi into the ice bath to stop the cooking process for about 30 seconds and then just put them out on some dry paper towels. For this process, I would suggest starting out with just 1 or 2 to make sure you've kind of nailed down the cooking process, and then you can start adding them into batches. Also, a side note is that you can skip the ice bath step if you just want to serve them right away, something like tomato sauce. However, for what I'm going to do, I want to crisp them up a little bit, which will work better if they are cooked and then a little bit dry on the paper towel before tossing them in the pan. And as you can see, some of my gnocchi kind of came apart a little bit when they were going to boil, and that's from just slightly undermixing the dough in that prior step. You know, I've made these several times and, you know, they usually come out much better than this, but today I was a little bit off, and that is perfectly okay. They're still going to crisp up really nice and are very pillowy soft. Let's cook them. For a cheeky brown butter sage sauce, which is one of my favorites, set a couple tablespoons of butter in a medium heat pan skillet. Once melted, add in a bunch of sage leaves and 2 whole cloves of garlic. You're going to let this cook down until that butter just barely starts to brown, and then you're going to toss in the cooked gnocchi and stir them around to let them crisp up a bit. Finally, I added in a couple hunks of cheese and some extra Parmesan over top. And I'm going to pop this under the broiler for about a minute to just crisp it up. And once it comes out, we have something truly delicious. Little clouds of potato and flour with butter, garlic, sage, and Parmesan. I mean, you can't go wrong with that. All right, everyone, that's gonna wrap it up for the video. Recipe will be linked in the video description below. Like I said, these didn't come out as good as I wanted them to. They're very super light, but they kind of fell apart just a little bit. Probably could have worked the dough a tiny bit more to get that binding going. But all in all, still a super delicious meal. It only gets better the more you make them. So go make yourself some gnocchi. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.